attacks on September 11, 2001 left the United States and the rest of the world shaken. In the aftermath of the chaos, the government demanded that we implement more security methods in order to prevent such atrocities. However, rather than using surveillance to track suspected criminals and terrorists, which was the original intention, the government's push for surveillance resulted in unregulated surveillance, where essentially all citizens' online and phone activities were under the constant watch of the government. In the last decade, it's become increasingly normal for civil liberties and privacy to be eroded, and for government agencies to spy on citizens to collect and store their personal information. So, there has been increased controversy over surveillance. While some argue that surveillance is necessary because it helps prevent terror attacks, the fact remains that surveillance infringes on the right to privacy. And regardless of whether you're a fan of left or right-wing policies, this affects every one of us. So, is government surveillance really worth it if it infringes on the citizens' civil liberties and right to privacy? Or is government surveillance necessary to ensure the safety of the nation? After 9/11, which left the nation shaken to the root, Congress immediately responded by hastily passing the U.S. Patriot Act, which was meant to extend government agencies' power to monitor suspicious communications or information in order to prevent terrorism. Empowered by this law, the National Security Agency, or NSA, which is responsible for the global monitoring and collection of information to combat threats to the country's security, greatly expanded mass surveillance. After Congress produced the bill, President George Bush signed off on it. Opponents of the Patriot Act argue that the judicial branch was not using its power of judicial review well enough to check the other two branches, saying that the judicial branch should not have allowed for Congress and the President to pass that law, as it infringes on the citizens' right to privacy, which is guaranteed in the Constitution.
No question to my mind that what the NSA has done is unconstitutional.
In 2013, former CIA worker and whistleblower Edward Snowden revealed that the NSA is combing through vast amounts of Americans' email and text communications, which was not part of the deal. The NSA has been collecting massive amounts of information from the things we do on our phones and over the internet. In reality, the U.S. Patriot Act, which was supposed to help the government prevent terrorist attacks, made it easier for the government to secretly spy on ordinary citizens by expanding the authority to monitor phone and email communications, collect bank and credit reporting records, and track the activity of citizens on the internet, all in the name of combating terrorism. This tracking of citizens' information is due to the misuse of Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which allowed for the government to collect any tangible things relative to an authorized investigation.
Congress never did intend to allow bulk collections when it passed Section 215.
Over the next several years, this was used not for its original purpose, but to sweep up the information of innocent U.S. citizens. The Fourth Amendment in the United States Bill of Rights protects citizens from illegal search and seizure of a person or property without a warrant or probable cause. Therefore, before searching Americans' private communications, the Fourth Amendment requires that the government demonstrate probable cause or individualized suspicion. The government has stated that their probable cause is ensuring the country's safety from terrorism. However, many argue that this cause does not constitute the government looking through all of the citizens' information, and therefore, the government is infringing on the citizens' right to privacy, which is guaranteed to them in the Fourth Amendment.
Point is, if you are keeping records, phone records, on virtually every call made in the United States of America, you know who somebody is calling, what time they're calling, where they're calling from. It is very hard for me to imagine that this is not a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Voted against the USA Patriot Act.
Secretary Clinton, do you regret your vote on the Patriot Act?
No, I don't. I think that it was necessary to make sure that we were able, after 9/11, to put in place the security that we needed. And it is true that it did require that there be a process. What happened, however, is that the Bush administration began to chip away at that process.
Edward Snowden's actions made headlines across the globe and prompted changes to the way governments spy on their population. In the United States, it culminated with Congress passing the USA Freedom Act as a response to Snowden's actions. The law limits the powers of government agencies to snoop on phone and internet records and ends the former policy of bulk collection of data on millions of Americans, which had been established by the Patriot Act more than a decade prior. 14 years after the September 11th terrorist attacks and 2 years after Edward Snowden's revelations about the extensive U.S. government's surveillance of phone and internet data, Americans continue to have mixed and sometimes even conflicting views about government surveillance programs. On one hand, a majority of Americans oppose government mass surveillance on citizens. But at the same time, Americans generally support monitoring the communications and activity of suspected terrorists. Here's a rundown of what we know about the attitudes towards U.S. government surveillance. According to the Pew Research Center, a majority of Americans, or about 54%, disapprove of the U.S. government spying on telephone and internet data as part of anti-terrorism efforts, while only 42% approve of the program. Secondly, most Americans don't see a need to sacrifice civil liberties to be safe from terrorism. In spring 2014, 74% of people said they should not give up privacy and freedom for the sake of safety, while just 22% said the opposite. Here's what our candidates have to say.
I want surveillance of these people. I want surveillance if we have to, and I don't care.
The constitutionality of government surveillance continues to be an issue as we enter the 2016 election. The public opinion is divided, with one side advocating for government surveillance to combat terrorism and the other side arguing against government surveillance, which they argue infringes on the citizens' civil liberties and right to privacy.
Government surveillance trespasses on civil liberties.
This is why I would most like to see the constitutionality of government surveillance to be discussed by the presidential candidates of the 2016 election. So now it's up to you. What's more important, privacy or security?